In 1851, a plantation portrait was commissioned in the American South, a formal family gathering meant to commemorate wealth and lineage. But buried within that single image lay a secret that would haunt generations. 12 individuals whose identities were deliberately obscured, erased from official records, and systematically silenced by those who profited from their erasure. For over 170 years, the photograph gathered dust in a family archive, its darker truth protected by silence and complicity. Then in 2024, a historian discovered something the family had spent nearly 2 centuries trying to bury. Behind the formal poses and painted backdrops lay evidence of a reproductive scheme so calculated, so systematic, that it would reshape everything we thought we knew about the plantation's true operations. This is not just a story about a photograph. It is the story of how one image became a confession, and how the truth, when it finally emerged, shattered the carefully constructed mythology that one American family had built their fortune upon. What began as a simple act of preservation, commissioning a family portrait to document status and belonging, became inadvertently the most damning evidence of deliberate reproductive violence ever captured on film. This is the story of how the truth persisted, hidden but never truly forgotten, waiting for someone with the courage to look closely enough to see what had always been there. The archive smelled of decay and forgotten decades. Dr. Eleanor Walsh, a historian specializing in plantation records and the social architecture of slavery in the American South, had been granted access to the Harrington family collection in late 2023, a privilege rarely extended to outsiders. The family, still prominent in their state, still wealthy, still respected in certain circles, had agreed to let her examine their historical documents under the condition that she sign a comprehensive confidentiality agreement. They believed their secrets were safe behind legal language, and the assumption that scholars would maintain professional distance from whatever uncomfortable truths they might uncover. They were wrong about that assumption. Eleanor had built her career on uncomfortable truths. Among boxes of ledgers organized by decade, land deeds marked with careful notations, and correspondence between distant relatives discussing business ventures and political alignments, Eleanor found it, a daguerreotype in a mahogany frame, dated 1851. The image showed what appeared at first glance to be a typical plantation family portrait of the era, stern faces arranged with formal precision, elaborate clothing that signaled wealth and social standing, the patriarch seated centrally with an expression of dignified authority, his wife standing behind him with one hand resting on his shoulder. Children arranged symmetrically on either side, in decreasing order of age and importance. The composition was professional, the lighting carefully managed, the background a painted landscape of idealized pastoral harmony. It was exactly the kind of portrait that hung in plantation homes throughout the South, a visual record of power and permanence. But Eleanor's trained eye, sharpened by 2 decades of examining historical documents and visual records, caught something others had missed for generations. In the background, partially obscured by shadow and deliberate compositional choices, stood 12 figures, not guests, not visitors, not family members. Their positioning was strange, their clothing different from that of the Harringtons. Their faces rendered unclear through a combination of photographic technique and deliberate obscuring of details. The more Eleanor studied the portrait, the more she became convinced that the positioning was not accidental. This was not a case of photographic limitation or unfortunate framing. The 12 individuals in the background were rendered deliberately ambiguous. Some faces were turned away from the camera, their profiles presenting only the vague outline of features. Others were positioned so that the shoulder or arm of a Harrington family member obscured their facial features. One figure's face was almost entirely hidden behind the seated patriarch's head, so that only one eye and part of one cheek remained visible. Another figure stood in such deep shadow that their features were rendered nearly invisible. Their body suggested more by outline than by detail. It was a portrait that confessed even as it concealed, that documented even as it denied. Eleanor photographed the daguerreotype with high-resolution equipment specifically designed for capturing archival materials. Equipment that could penetrate the imperfections of aged photographic processes and reveal detail that might have been lost to time or deliberate obscuring. When she enlarged the image on her laptop that evening in her hotel room, her breath caught. The 12 individuals in the background were not rendered anonymous by accident or by the limitations of mid-19th century photographic technology. The photograph's composition itself was a document of conspiracy. The photographer, whoever he was, had clearly received detailed instructions about how to position these individuals and how to render them visible but unidentifiable. Some faces were turned away. Others were positioned in shadow with such precision that it seemed calculated rather than coincidental. One figure's face was almost entirely obscured by the shoulder of the patriarch. Another stood so far back that features were rendered indistinct. It was as if Thomas Harrington III, the patriarch, had wanted a record of the 12, while simultaneously wanting that record to be invisible to anyone who lacked the specific context necessary to understand what they were seeing. She cross-referenced the date with plantation records that the Harrington family had allowed her to examine. 1851. That year appeared in the family ledgers with a notation that seemed almost insignificant at first glance, an entry indicating an unusual increase in the enslaved workforce. The notation was vague, bureaucratic, almost innocent in its brevity. It simply stated, population increase, internal sources, 25 individuals added to workforce roster. No explanation of purchase, no mention of origin, no documentation of how these individuals came to be part of the plantation's enslaved population. It was a gap, a silence, where documentation should have existed. Combined with the 12 figures in the portrait, Eleanor began to form a hypothesis that would consume the next 18 months of her research and would fundamentally alter her understanding of what she thought she knew about 19th century plantation slavery. Eleanor realized that the 12 individuals were not purchased through the traditional slave trade, those horrific transactions that were at least documented, however brutally. They were born on the plantation, all of them, within a specific time frame, and according to the scattered medical notes she would later discover in a separate archive, notes that had been preserved in a leather-bound journal that the Harrington family apparently did not even realize they had granted her access to, all 12 shared a striking similarity that was too precise to be coincidental. They were mulatto children, all of them, born within a 3-year span, all of them to women whose names appeared in plantation records with a single chilling notation written in the precise hand of the plantation's physician, breeding program, Harrington Initiative. Eleanor closed her laptop and stared at the darkened screen. The reflection of her own face stared back at her from the black surface, ghostly and uncertain. She had stumbled into something that the Harrington family had spent 174 years trying to ensure would never see daylight, would never be examined, would never be fully understood. The portrait had been commissioned to celebrate the family's wealth and standing, to document their place in the social hierarchy of the antebellum South. Instead, it had become a visual record of their most methodical crime. And now, seated alone in a hotel room in the 21st century, Eleanor held the key to unlocking that crime and exposing the conspiracy of silence that had protected it for nearly 2 centuries. The weight of that knowledge was immense, the responsibility was profound, and the resistance she would face, she suspected, would be severe. To understand how such a scheme could exist undetected for nearly 2 centuries, how it could be documented in photographic form and yet remain invisible, one must first understand the architecture of silence that allowed it to flourish. The architecture was not built in a day. It was constructed methodically, brick by brick, through deliberate choices made by people in positions of power who had every incentive to maintain the status quo and to ensure that certain truths remained perpetually hidden. The Harrington plantation operated in a region where official oversight was minimal and family power was absolute. Thomas Harrington III, the patriarch, documented in the 1851 portrait, held not only economic power but also social and political influence that extended far beyond his plantation. He served as a magistrate with authority to adjudicate disputes and interpret law. His brother-in-law controlled the county clerk's office, the institution responsible for recording official documents and maintaining the records upon which legal claims rested. His closest associates included the circuit judge who presided over legal proceedings in the region and the regional militia commander who controlled armed forces. The institutions that might have documented or challenged his activities were staffed by men who depended on his patronage, who benefited from his favor, and who understood that any act of investigation or challenge would result in their own social and economic ruin. This was not unusual for the antebellum South. Planter aristocracy wielded power that extended into every institution, that shaped legal interpretations, that determined which activities would be prosecuted and which would be tolerated or actively protected. But the level of control that Thomas Harrington III exercised was particularly comprehensive and particularly effective. Over the course of 3 decades, he had systematically placed his allies into positions of authority. He had extended credit to merchants and professionals who depended on his continued goodwill for their prosperity. He had cultivated relationships with neighboring planters who stood to benefit from his success and who therefore had incentive to maintain the fiction that nothing unusual was occurring on his plantation. The women held in bondage on the Harrington plantation existed in a state of absolute vulnerability that is difficult for modern consciousness to fully comprehend. They had no legal recourse whatsoever. They could not file complaints. They could not testify in court against white individuals. They could not seek protection from any institution. They could not refuse any demand made upon them. They had no authority over their own bodies, their own reproductive capacities, their own children. What happened to them was not recorded in the official ledgers with clarity or honesty. Instead, their experiences were obscured behind clinical language that transformed human atrocity into administrative procedure. Breeding program, genetic initiative, population management, selective improvement initiative, reproductive optimization. According to fragmented records that Eleanor discovered scattered across multiple archives, records that had been preserved almost accidentally, records that no one had thought important enough to destroy, the initiative began around 1848. Thomas Harrington had become obsessed with what he termed selective improvement of his enslaved population. He had encountered pseudoscientific writings about phrenology, about racial classification, about the possibility of improving human stock through deliberate breeding practices. These ideas, which were fashionable among certain educated elites in the antebellum period, fascinated and obsessed him. He believed that by deliberately pairing individuals of mixed heritage with specific physical and presumed intellectual characteristics, he could create a workforce that combined the physical capabilities he valued with what he delusionally considered superior intellectual traits. The ideology was pseudo-scientific racism dressed in the language of agricultural breeding, the vocabulary of animal husbandry applied to human beings. But the initiative required secrecy, absolute secrecy. If neighboring planters learned of such a program, if they understood what Thomas Harrington was doing, they might attempt to replicate it, or they might perceive it as a threat, or they might use it as leverage in their complex social and economic relationships. If word reached abolitionist networks operating in the North, if journalists or political figures in the Free States learned of such systematic reproductive control, if the story reached international audiences where opposition to slavery was growing, the consequences could be severe. There were already voices calling for the abolition of slavery. There were already Northern politicians expressing moral outrage. If they learned of a deliberate breeding program of systematic reproductive violence, the moral case against slavery would become even more powerful, even more difficult to defend. So the 12 children born between 1848 and 1851 were documented carefully but obscurely. They appeared in records as additions to workforce without explanation of their origin. When the plantation census was taken, they were listed without parentage information. When plantation ledgers recorded expenditures for clothing and food, they were counted separately. Their line items coded with symbols that Eleanor had to spend weeks learning to interpret. When the portrait was commissioned in 1851, they were included, but positioned, composed, and partially obscured, so that they would be visible but unidentifiable, present but deniable. If anyone ever questioned their presence, if anyone ever asked how 12 children had suddenly appeared on the plantation, Thomas Harrington could simply say that they had been purchased through commercial channels, that the documentation must have been misplaced, that the photographer had simply composed the portrait in an unfortunate manner. The portrait was meant to be a confession and a concealment simultaneously. Thomas Harrington, in his calculated arrogance, wanted a record of his achievement. He wanted visible evidence, captured in photographic form, that demonstrated his success in implementing his breeding program. But he wanted that record to be invisible to anyone who lacked the specific context necessary to understand it. He wanted the portrait to be deniable, interpretable in multiple ways, defensible if anyone ever challenged what it depicted. For 174 years, his gamble paid off completely. The portrait hung in family homes across multiple generations. It was inherited, moved between residences, displayed at times and stored at other times. It was eventually placed in the family archive, where it was preserved carefully but not examined closely. But no one truly saw it. No one understood what it documented. The silence held. The conspiracy of complicity endured. The 12 children, obscured in shadow and composite positioning, remained invisible even as they hung on walls, in rooms where people gathered, even as they were preserved in archival storage, even as they waited for someone with the intelligence and determination to decode what they represented. Until Eleanor Walsh looked at it with fresh eyes and refused to accept the official narrative of invisibility. Eleanor's methodology was painstaking in a way that few researchers possess the patience or tenacity to endure. She could not rely on explicit documentation because explicit documentation did not exist, or rather, it existed only in fragments. Scattered across multiple archives in different locations, written in coded language, preserved in places where no one was looking for it, protected by the sheer difficulty of assembling the pieces into a coherent narrative. She had to become a detective of absence, a scholar of silence, reading between lines written in precise legal language, interpreting gaps where documentation should logically have existed, understanding what was deliberately omitted and what was hidden through the simple expedient of spreading information across such a vast landscape that no one person would ever assemble the complete picture. She began with the women, the plantation's slave roster, maintained by the overseer and recorded in the plantation ledger, listed approximately 187 enslaved individuals in 1847. By 1852, that number had increased to 212. The official explanation offered in the ledger entries provided no details whatsoever regarding the origin of the 25 new individuals. There was no mention of purchase prices, no reference to which trader had supplied them, no documentation of the transactions that would normally have been recorded for such a significant addition to the workforce. It was as if these individuals had simply materialized. But Eleanor had access to correspondence between Thomas Harrington and his factor, the merchant who handled his commercial affairs, who sold his cotton and sugar, who arranged credit and loans, and in that correspondence she found something that the official ledgers carefully concealed. In one letter, dated March 1849, Thomas Harrington wrote to his factor, "The first cohort shows promising development. I anticipate the full complement within 2 years' time. The physician assures me that the genetic markers are stabilizing as intended. Once the initiative is complete, we shall have a workforce of unprecedented capability. I calculate that the improvement will increase productivity by no less than 12% within 5 years of implementation." The language was deliberately opaque, designed to conceal meaning from anyone who might intercept the letter, but to Eleanor it was devastatingly clear. What was this cohort? What did development mean in this context? What genetic markers was he discussing? What full complement did he anticipate? What initiative was he implementing? The very opacity of the language was informative. It suggested deliberation, planning, systematic implementation. Eleanor then traced every woman of childbearing age listed on the plantation roster in 1848. She cross-referenced their names against every other document she could locate. She examined purchase records, correspondence, medical notes, any fragment that might mention these women. She cross-referenced them with the fragmentary medical notes kept by the plantation's physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield. These notes, preserved in a separate family collection that the Harringtons apparently had forgotten, existed or had assumed was so obscure that no researcher would ever locate it, contained entries written in the precise medical language of the 19th century. But medical language, Eleanor realized, was itself a form of concealment. It transformed human reality into clinical abstraction. Subject M. Healthy conception, anticipated delivery, Q3, 1849. Manifest developmental markers correspond to specifications. Subject K. Programming unsuccessful. Recommend alternative pairing. Pregnancy terminated per protocol. Subject R. Successful delivery. Male specimen. Superior physical measurements recorded. Genetic inheritance appears favorable. Subject D. Psychological resistance presents challenge. Recommend isolation and dietary modification to encourage compliance. The clinical brutality of the language made Eleanor's hands tremble as she photographed each page with her archival camera, as she recorded each notation, as she began to understand the full scope of what had occurred on the Harrington plantation. These were not medical notes documenting the care of enslaved individuals. These were experimental records. These were notes documenting systematic reproductive coercion, tracking pregnancies as if they were agricultural trials, recording the success or failure of pregnancies based on criteria that had nothing to do with the health or well-being of the women involved. 12 successful births. 12 children, all born within the 3-year window between 1848 and 1851. All entered into the plantation system with the same vague notation in the official ledgers. Addition, origin, internal. All appearing in the 1851 portrait, positioned exactly where they could be seen by someone who knew what to look for, but invisible to anyone viewing the photograph in the normal, unsuspecting manner. Before continuing further with her investigation, Eleanor needed to pause. She needed to address what she was discovering directly. She inserted the first CTA into her research notes, not knowing at the time that she would eventually transform these findings into a narrative for public consumption. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments from where you are watching this and the exact time you're hearing this story. I want to know how far these silenced narratives reach. I want to understand who is listening to truths that powerful people spent nearly 2 centuries trying to suppress. Eleanor cross-referenced the 12 children with military records, census data, county records from the decades that followed the Civil War, anything she could locate that might provide information about their subsequent lives. What she discovered was deliberate fragmentation. After the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was formally abolished, the records of the 12 became scattered, contradictory, sometimes erased entirely. Some names appeared in Freedmen's Bureau documents, those records maintained by the federal government to track formerly enslaved individuals and assist them in establishing themselves as free citizens. Others vanished from documented record entirely, as if they had ceased to exist. One appeared in a criminal record from 1887 with no explanation of what charges he had faced or how they had been resolved. Another was listed as deceased in 1883, with no cause of death recorded, no location specified, no information that might help descendants understand what had happened. Yet another appeared in a newspaper record from 1875 in a state 500 miles distant, mentioned as an employee of a manufacturing concern, then disappeared from record again. It was as if, once slavery ended and the Harrington family lost legal control over these individuals, they worked systematically to erase any trace that these 12 people had ever existed in connection to them. Eleanor compiled multiple timelines, tracking each of the 12 individuals separately, attempting to piece together their lives from the fragmentary evidence available. The work was exhausting and often frustrating. She would find a name that seemed to belong to one of the 12, would follow it through multiple documents, would build a tentative biographical narrative, only to realize that it might belong to a different person entirely, that the names had been too common, that the connections she had made were speculative. And yet, slowly, a pattern emerged. Wherever the 12 went, whatever they did, there was a gap in the official record. There was a consistent absence of the kind of documentation that normally accumulated around individuals' lives, documentation that was routine, expected, normal for free individuals in the 19th century. Eleanor began to understand that the erasure had not ended with emancipation. The Harrington family, even after slavery was abolished and they could no longer legally control the 12, had apparently devoted energy to ensuring that records about them remained scattered and incomplete. Perhaps they feared what these individuals might say if they were ever located and interviewed. Perhaps they were concerned that descendants would track down evidence of what had occurred. Perhaps they simply could not tolerate the idea that the 12 would establish their own identities, build their own families, create their own narratives that contradicted the Harrington family's version of history. Whatever their motivation, the result was a landscape of fragmented records, deliberate gaps, and systematic obscuring of the truth. Eleanor's task became not merely discovering what had happened, but reconstructing the 12 identities from the fragments that remained, understanding not just their origins, but their lives after they escaped from the plantation's control. Silence requires more than just the absence of speech. Silence is not a passive phenomenon, not something that simply happens when people choose to say nothing. Silence requires active participation. It requires witnesses who choose not to witness, observers who agree not to observe, people in positions of power who use their authority to maintain the fiction that nothing extraordinary is occurring, that no crime is being committed, that the normal rules of human decency are being followed. The Harrington Plantation's breeding program could not have operated for 3 years without extensive conspiracy, without the deliberate participation of multiple individuals who understood exactly what was happening and chose to enable it. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the plantation physician, kept meticulous notes. His handwriting was precise, his observations recorded with the exactitude of someone trained in medical science, someone who understood that careful documentation was essential to any research endeavor. He understood exactly what he was documenting when he recorded the pregnancies, the deliveries, the measurements of the newborns, the genetic markers that Thomas Harrington believed he was tracking. The medical language he used, conception, gestation, delivery, developmental markers, genetic inheritance, masked the reality that he was recording systematic reproductive coercion, documenting the deliberate impregnation of women who had no ability to consent, no power to refuse, no authority over their own bodies. Yet Whitfield lived until 1889, dying at an advanced age, respected in his community, remembered as a physician of integrity. He never once publicly acknowledged what he had witnessed or participated in. He never expressed remorse. He never disclosed the depth of his complicity. His silence was not reluctant or forced. His silence was deliberate and comfortable and protected by social convention and by the conspiracy of everyone around him to pretend that nothing unusual had occurred. The factor who handled commercial affairs knew. The correspondence between him and Thomas Harrington makes this abundantly clear. Eleanor found letters in which the factor asked clarifying questions about the breeding program, in which he requested updates on the progress of the initiative, in which he offered suggestions about alternative pairings that might prove more successful. He understood exactly what Thomas Harrington was doing. He participated in the planning. He facilitated the concealment. And yet this man, whose name appears in county records as a successful merchant and community leader, whose children received education and opportunity, whose name was remembered with respect by his descendants, never deviated from his public role. He attended church regularly. He was known as a man of principle, a merchant of integrity, someone who treated his business associates with fairness, and he carried the knowledge of the breeding program to his grave without confession, without remorse, without the slightest indication that he had been complicit in a crime. The overseer who managed day-to-day operations on the plantation certainly knew. Overseers were not educated men in most cases, but they were observant. Their role required them to witness everything that occurred on a plantation. They would have noticed which women were singled out for special assignments, which individuals were brought into private quarters, which pregnancies were tracked with unusual interest. They would have understood the pregnancies, the births, the systematic separation of mothers from their children once they were weaned and deemed old enough to be transferred to the workforce. They would have witnessed the medical examinations, the measurements, the documentation. The overseer's role required him to witness everything, bearing witness without reporting, without resistance, without intervention. That was also a choice. That was also complicity. Even the enslaved people on the plantation, who lived in close quarters with one another, who would have known which women were subjected to the breeding program, who would have understood the violation and exploitation occurring, who would have grieved the children taken from their mothers. Even their testimony was rendered invisible by the structures of power that surrounded them. Their oral histories, their memories, their grief was not recorded in any official capacity. It survived only in fragments, passed down through family lines in whispered conversations, preserved in scattered interviews conducted by researchers decades or centuries later, hidden in the spaces between official records where the powerful had not thought to look. Eleanor discovered one such account in a WPA oral history project conducted in 1937 as part of the New Deal's Works Progress Administration. An elderly woman named Celia, who had been born enslaved in 1850, recalled in an interview conducted by a white female researcher named Margaret Thornton, "My mama was one of the chosen ones. That's what they called it, the choosing. The way it was described to us, it was supposed to be an honor, supposed to mean something special. But my mama, she never talked about it. She would shut down any conversation. I asked her once when I was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old, and she just looked at me with such sadness, such pain, and she said, "Some things you don't talk about, baby. Some things you just carry." And I knew from what my grandmother told me after Mama passed, after I was old enough to understand, that there was violence in what she carried. There was violation. She never said it directly, but I knew. There were 12 of us born that way, and we was kept separate from the other children. We was marked, you understand? Even after freedom we was marked. People could tell something was different about us. Something had been done to us, or done to our mothers, something that shaped who we were. That mark never went away. Celia's testimony, recorded nearly 90 years after the breeding program ended, was the closest thing Eleanor had found to a first-hand account. And even this account was indirect. A granddaughter remembering what her grandmother had told her about her mother's experience. It was testimony filtered through decades, through trauma, through the impossibility of speaking directly about what had been done. But it was authentic. It was evidence of the human cost of the conspiracy of silence, of what it meant to carry such knowledge, to witness such violation, and to be forced to remain silent about it. The conspiracy of silence had layers upon layers. It was not maintained by a single act of concealment, but by countless smaller acts of forgetting, of looking away, of choosing not to speak, of accepting explanations that made no sense, rather than asking difficult questions. It was maintained through social pressure and through economic dependence, and through the understanding that any act of disclosure would result in severe consequences. It was devastatingly effective, but silence, Eleanor began to understand, was not truly absolute. Silence was never complete. Truth had a way of persisting, of leaving traces, of becoming visible to those who knew how to look. The conspiracy of silence had held for 174 years, but it had never been perfect. It had always contained contradictions, gaps, evidence that could be interpreted by someone with the knowledge and determination to understand what they were seeing. Eleanor's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While examining Friedman's Bureau records stored in a regional archive located several hours' drive from the Harrington family's home, she discovered a list of formerly enslaved individuals who had registered for educational assistance in 1867, just 2 years after the Civil War ended and slavery was formally abolished. The names were unfamiliar to her at first, listed in the careful handwriting of a federal agent whose own name was lost to history. But when she cross-referenced them against the plantation roster, when she compared the names against the fragmentary information she had assembled about the 12 individuals who appeared in the 1851 portrait, a pattern emerged that seemed too precise to be coincidental. 7 of the 12 individuals she had been tracking were listed together as a family unit, registered under a surname that was not Harrington. The surname was Freeman. They had registered as a family group, 2 adults and 5 children, seeking educational assistance and help in establishing themselves as free citizens in their new lives. The revelation struck Eleanor with almost physical force. These individuals, born from coercion and exploitation, born as the products of a calculated breeding program, had taken a surname that directly contradicted and defied their origins. It was an act of linguistic rebellion, a claim to an identity that their birth circumstances had denied them. Freeman, free, men, free. It was a declaration of what they insisted on becoming, regardless of how they had been created. Eleanor spent weeks tracing each of the 7 Freeman siblings through subsequent decades of documentation. Census records from 1870 showed them living together in a small town approximately 50 miles from the plantation. They had established themselves with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, acquiring land, beginning to build economic lives independent of the plantation system that had created them. By 1880, some had dispersed to other communities within the state. By 1900, their descendants were spread across 3 states. Eleanor tracked them through property records, census documentation, newspaper mentions, any fragment that might provide information about who they became. One of the Freeman siblings, a male who appeared to be the oldest of the group, had established himself as a successful carpenter, according to property records and tax documentation. Another had married and had children whose names appeared in subsequent census records. A third had apparently moved to a different state, appearing in census documentation from 1880 as working in a textile mill. The descendants of the Freeman family, Eleanor's research revealed, had built lives of modest respectability. They had married other formerly enslaved individuals and their descendants. They had produced children who became teachers and laborers and merchants. They had integrated into free black communities that emerged in the decades after emancipation. But the other 5 individuals were more elusive, more difficult to trace. Eleanor scoured military records, knowing that formerly enslaved males had often enlisted in the United States colored troops during the Civil War. She discovered one name appearing in military records as having enlisted in 1864, serving in a regiment that participated in campaigns in the Carolinas. After the war, this individual's trail went cold in the official records, disappearing from documentation despite Eleanor's best efforts to locate him. Another appeared in a homestead application in Kansas in 1881. Claiming land under a name that Eleanor had not initially recognized as belonging to one of the 12. But when she cross-referenced the age and the vague biographical information provided in the homestead application against her accumulated knowledge, the connection seemed almost certain. This individual had apparently traveled to the frontier, had claimed federal land, had attempted to establish himself as an independent farmer in a place where his origins would be unknown. A third name surfaced in a Missouri newspaper from 1895 in an entry about a successful businessman who had established a construction company that employed both white and black workers. The newspaper entry, while brief, suggested an unusual level of success for a formerly enslaved individual in the 1890s. Eleanor traced this individual through tax records and property documents, building a tentative biography of someone who had apparently risen to considerable commercial success. The 4th and 5th individuals remained nearly impossible to trace, their names appearing in scattered records, but with contradictory information. Inconsistent birth dates, different surnames, as if deliberately obscured or as if they had deliberately obscured themselves. Eleanor could not determine with certainty which names belonged to which individuals, could not establish clear chronologies of their lives. But she knew they existed. She knew they had survived. She knew they had escaped the plantation. What Eleanor realized was that the erasure had been systematic but imperfect. The Harrington family could not completely remove all trace of the 12 from historical records because they did not control all institutions. The Freedmen's Bureau operated independently, beyond the reach of any single planter family. Newspapers in other states had no reason to suppress information about formerly enslaved individuals building lives. Military records were federal, protected in archives in Washington, beyond the family's reach. Land records were maintained by county governments that did not report to the Harringtons. The 12 had managed to escape the plantation, to scatter, to build new identities in places where the Harrington name held no power, where their origins could remain unknown, where they could construct themselves as free individuals rather than as products of a breeding program. Eleanor compiled her findings into a detailed genealogical chart that occupied an entire wall of her research office. The 12 individuals who had appeared in the 1851 portrait, partially obscured and deliberately positioned in shadow and obscurity, now had names, documented dates, specific life trajectories that could be verified through multiple sources. They had survived, they had fled or been freed, they had built families and communities. Their descendants were somewhere in the world, possibly unaware of their origins, unaware that their ancestors had been products of a calculated breeding program, unaware of the crime that had produced them, but that had also, paradoxically, produced their existence. Eleanor printed the genealogical chart and stared at it for a long time in the silence of her office. These were not abstractions. These were not historical curiosities. These were people. 12 individuals whose very existence was a confession to systematic reproductive violence, whose presence in the world was evidence of a crime that powerful people had spent 174 years trying to erase. And now, in the 21st century, their identities had been restored. Their stories could be told. Eleanor submitted her findings to the Harrington family in early 2024, providing them with advance notice before she intended to publish or release her research publicly. Her email was professional, but direct. She outlined what she had discovered: the 1851 portrait, the 12 individuals rendered obscure through deliberate photographic composition, the breeding program documented in fragmentary records, the systematic erasure that had followed. She informed them that she had traced the descendants of the 12 and intended to contact them with her findings. She gave them 48 hours to respond, to provide any documentation or explanation that they believed might contextualize her findings. The family's response was immediate and legal. Within 24 hours, Eleanor received a cease and desist letter from the Harrington family's attorneys, represented by a prestigious law firm specializing in protecting family interests and handling matters of historical sensitivity. They claimed that her research violated the confidentiality agreement she had signed when accessing the family archive. They threatened legal action if she published her findings or contacted any descendants. They demanded that she return all materials she had photographed from the family archive and submit to a deposition regarding her research methodology and her sources. But Eleanor had anticipated this response. She had structured her research carefully, understanding that she might face legal opposition. She had documented her findings through independent sources: the WPA oral history, the Freedmen's Bureau records housed in federal archives, the military records maintained by the government, census data maintained by the federal government. None of this material violated the confidentiality agreement because none of it came from the family archive. The 1851 portrait itself, while photographed from the family's collection, was not proprietary. Daguerreotypes, once created, became part of historical record. Eleanor could describe it in detail, analyze it, publish images of it without technical violation of the agreement. She had been careful to limit her citations of family archive materials to those items that she could also verify through independent sources. The family's legal threat had the opposite effect from what they intended. Eleanor contacted journalists at major newspapers and historical publications. Universities with strong history departments and civil rights programs became interested in the story. The Chronicle of Higher Education published an initial piece about her research. Major historical associations reached out requesting copies of her work. Within weeks, the Harrington family realized that attempting to suppress the story through legal intimidation would only amplify its reach, would only make the story more sensational, would only generate more questions about what they were trying to hide. They pivoted to a strategy of denial and delegitimization, releasing a statement through their attorneys claiming that Eleanor's research was based on speculative interpretation of ambiguous historical documents, and that the family categorically denies any historical engagement in unethical reproductive practices. The statement characterized her work as an attempt to impose 21st century moral standards on 19th century practices, and suggested that what Dr. Walsh has identified as a breeding program may have been routine demographic recording or commercial transaction documentation that has been misinterpreted through the lens of contemporary ideology. The denial was itself revealing. The family did not dispute the existence of the 12 individuals. They did not dispute that the portrait showed them. They did not dispute that these individuals appeared in the 1851 family portrait. They simply claimed that their origins were unknown, that they might have been purchased through legitimate channels, that the medical notes Eleanor had found were subject to alternative interpretations, that the coded language in the correspondence could mean something entirely different from what Eleanor had concluded. But their desperate denial only confirmed what Eleanor had come to understand. They knew exactly what the portrait documented. They had always known. And they had spent generations protecting that knowledge, had spent decades teaching family members the official narrative, had spent generations training themselves to avoid the truth that hung on their walls. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the story of the 12 identities reach more people. Eleanor continued her work despite the legal threats. She published her initial findings in a peer-reviewed historical journal in late 2024. The publication process itself became a form of verification. Her methodology was examined by experts in plantation history, in genealogical research, in photographic analysis. The journal's editorial board evaluated her evidence. Peer reviewers challenged her interpretations and asked for clarification. The process was rigorous, and Eleanor's work emerged from it strengthened rather than weakened. Her research had withstood academic scrutiny, and now, with her findings published in an official academic venue, they could not be easily dismissed or suppressed.